Perhaps the greatest lie we've been told about life is this: in order to be worthy of love, respect, and belonging, you have to be strong all the time. Strong emotionally, strong spiritually, strong in the face of failure. And little by little, this idea shapes us from the inside out. We learn to hide what we feel, to mask what hurts, to smile when our soul is asking for rest. The problem is that this apparent strength comes with a quiet cost. Because while we try to look flawless on the outside, something slowly breaks on the inside. Anxiety, comparison, emotional exhaustion, a persistent sense of not being enough. Not because we are weak, but because we are human trying to live beyond our own humanity. And here the paradox emerges. The more we try to appear complete, the emptier we feel. The more we avoid vulnerability, the further we drift from ourselves. What if real courage isn't about protecting yourself, but about allowing yourself to be seen? What if what you call weakness is actually the doorway to a more authentic, conscious, and meaningful life? That is precisely the deep inversion Brené Brown proposes in The Courage to Be Imperfect, a book that doesn't promise quick fixes, but offers something far rarer: emotional truth. Throughout this journey, I'm not going to invite you to be better, stronger, or more efficient. I'm going to invite you to be whole, to look at shame without running from it, to recognize vulnerability as a condition of existence, to understand that belonging doesn't grow out of adaptation, but out of authenticity, and that inner growth begins when we stop fighting who we are. This is not a video to watch in a hurry. It's an invitation to pause, to listen inward, to become aware. If you feel tired of holding up masks, of meeting unrealistic expectations, of living in constant fear of making mistakes, maybe this is the moment to discover something liberating. Life doesn't ask for perfection, it asks for presence. The myth of strength: why we learn to hide who we are. I grew up believing that being strong meant not needing anyone, swallowing your tears, handling everything on your own, projecting confidence even when, inside, everything was shaking. For a long time, I thought this was emotional maturity. Today, with more awareness, I see that it was fear. Fear of not belonging, fear of being seen, fear of my own human imperfection. And maybe, as you listen now, something in this resonates quietly within you too. Our culture taught us a distorted idea of strength. From an early age, we learned that vulnerability is weakness, that showing emotion means losing control, that asking for help is a sign of incompetence. At work, in relationships, even in contemporary spirituality, there's a subtle pressure to look put together all the time. But no one can sustain that image without paying an inner price. Depth psychology calls this fragmentation, when we distance ourselves from who we truly are in order to be accepted. In The Courage to Be Imperfect, Brené Brown touches this wound directly. She doesn't start by talking about emotional courage. She starts by dismantling the stage where we pretend to be strong. Because before we can talk about inner growth, we have to admit something uncomfortable. Much of our strength is performative. It's social armor. A well-rehearsed character that says, "I'm fine," when in truth something inside is asking for care. I remember a period in my life when I seemed to have everything under control. A packed schedule, fast decisions, a steady posture. People praised my discipline, my leadership. But at night, in the quiet, there was a strange kind of exhaustion, not physical but existential. It was the weight of holding up an identity that left no room for doubt. And here's the paradox. The more we try to look strong, the more fragile we become inside. Existential philosophy helps us understand this. Thinkers like Kierkegaard already pointed out that human despair isn't found in suffering itself, but in denying who we are. When we hide our fragility, we create a gap between our real life and our lived life. And that gap charges high interest, anxiety, disconnection, shallow relationships, and a growing distance from meaning. Maybe you felt this in small, everyday moments. When you avoid saying how you really feel to prevent conflict. When you take on more than you can handle just to avoid disappointing someone. When you stay silent in a meeting, in a relationship, or even in a conversation with yourself. These are small, almost invisible gestures, but they teach the soul, over time, that it isn't fully welcome. What's most curious is that no one explicitly tells us to hide. There's no sign that says, "Be perfect." But there is the look, the unspoken judgment, the constant comparison. And slowly we learn to edit our authenticity in order to fit in. This is where shame is born, not as guilt for what we've done, but as rejection of who we are. We're not even talking about it directly yet, but it's already whispering. Brené Brown shows that the myth of strength doesn't protect us from pain, it only distances us from the truth. And the truth, however uncomfortable, is the only place where emotional healing begins. Admitting fragility isn't comfortable, but it's deeply freeing. Because when I stop fighting to look strong, something inside me finally rests. If you want to try this in a practical way, start small. Choose a safe space, a person, a journal, a moment of silence, and allow yourself to name what you feel without correcting it, without justifying it. Just observe. Awareness is born this way, when we stop monitoring ourselves all the time. It's a simple gesture, but it opens a door that changes everything. Because deep down, the question isn't, how can I be stronger? But something far more honest and transformative: what did I have to hide in order to survive? And when that question appears, another begins to form right behind it. One that leads us straight into the quiet territory of shame, that invisible force shaping choices, relationships, and destinies without us even noticing. Shame, the silence that shapes our choices. For a long time, I believed shame was just a passing discomfort, something that showed up when I messed up and then went away. But no, shame is far more sophisticated, quieter, and much more persistent than that. It doesn't shout, it whispers. And precisely because of that, it governs our choices with unsettling efficiency. As Brené Brown explains, shame doesn't say, you did something wrong, but there's something wrong with you. And that difference changes everything. Guilt can teach us. Shame paralyzes us. Guilt is tied to behavior. Shame is tied to identity. When I make a mistake and feel guilt, I can repair it. When I make a mistake and feel shame, I hide. I withdraw. I shut down. And that's how it begins shaping decisions. What I say, what I don't say, what I try, what I abandon before I even begin. In depth psychology, shame is a social emotion. It's born in the gaze of the other, real or imagined. I saw this clearly in simple situations. How many times did I avoid asking for help because I didn't want to look incompetent? How many times did I keep an idea to myself out of fear of judgment? How many times did I smile politely while something inside me felt small? These micro-choices, repeated over years, build a life that is less daring, less authentic, less alive. A life edited to avoid exposure. Shame also sneaks into spirituality. There's a subtle belief that we're supposed to be evolved, at peace, figured out. And when we're not, we feel inadequate even before the sacred, as if our doubts, anger, and fear make us less worthy of spiritual belonging. Brené Brown dismantles this with emotional courage. There is no inner growth without crossing emotional truth. At work, shame often wears a polished suit. It's called perfectionism, overproductivity, relentless self-criticism. On the surface, everything works. Inside, there's constant tension, a fear of failing, of not being enough. I've seen brilliant people shrink themselves because they couldn't tolerate the possibility of making a public mistake. Not because they lacked talent, but because unnamed shame had too much power. One of the most transformative insights of the courage to be imperfect is that shame thrives in secrecy. It needs silence, isolation, and emotional darkness to survive. When we don't talk about what we feel, the mind creates harsh stories. I'm the only one like this. No one would understand. If they knew, they'd walk away. Repeated over time, these narratives erode self-acceptance. A simple but powerful practice is to begin identifying your shame triggers. Notice when you shut down, when you get defensive automatically, when you feel the urge to disappear. Gently ask yourself, what am I believing about myself right now? Not to judge, but to bring awareness. Awareness dissolves automatic patterns. And that is emotional healing in motion. Brené Brown also reminds us that shame loves comparison. Social media, success metrics, unrealistic standards of happiness, all of it feeds the sense of inadequacy. That's why a concrete act of personal growth is to reduce exposure to what fuels this cycle and increase spaces of real presence. Deep conversations, humanizing books, silence that helps organize the inner world. Books like The Gifts of Imperfection and Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning are powerful allies in this process. When I started talking about my shame with people I trusted, something unexpected happened. Connection. Not rejection. Not distance. Belonging. Shame loses its grip when it meets empathy. But before that step, there's something else that must be faced with courage. Vulnerability as an unavoidable condition of human life. Not a choice, but a reality. Because if shame is born from the fear of being seen, the next question naturally arises. What if being seen isn't the problem? What if the real risk is continuing to hide? This is where vulnerability begins to shift its meaning, and with it, everything we believed about strength and weakness. Vulnerability is not weakness, it's the inevitable risk of living. For a long time, I treated vulnerability as a mistake, something to avoid, fix, or conceal. I believed that living well meant controlling emotions, predicting outcomes, minimizing risk. Only later did I understand, largely through the courage to be imperfect, that this need for control was actually an escape from life itself. Because living, by definition, involves exposure. Vulnerability isn't something we choose on our bravest days. It's an ontological condition of being human. To love is to be vulnerable. To create is to be vulnerable. To lead is to be vulnerable. To age is to be vulnerable. Existential philosophy has always known this. Heidegger spoke of thrownness. We're born into the world without guarantees, without manuals, without promises of safety. Brené Brown translates this deep truth into everyday language with almost therapeutic clarity. The problem is that we've been taught to confuse vulnerability with emotional weakness. When someone cries, gets emotional, or admits they don't know, we often think of instability. But look closely. The people who move us most aren't the flawless ones but the authentic ones. Those who dare to say, "I'm not sure, this scares me, this matters to me." There's a quiet strength in that gesture, a strength rooted in truth. I noticed this in myself when I started owning my limits. Saying "I don't know" instead of making something up. Asking for help instead of pretending to be self-sufficient. Sharing doubts instead of performing certainty. Surprisingly, my authority didn't diminish, it deepened. People trust those who are human more than those who seem untouchable. That's a powerful lesson in vulnerable leadership. In depth psychology, vulnerability is the gateway to transformation. Without it, there's no real contact with the unconscious, no emotional integration, no healing. It takes courage to feel what we avoid, to move through uncertainty without emotional anesthesia. Brené Brown is clear. When we try to avoid vulnerability, we also avoid joy, love, and belonging. A simple exercise to cultivate this emotional courage is to notice where you over-control. Relationships. Or personal image. Ask yourself, what am I trying not to feel? Often, behind control lies fear of rejection or inadequacy. Naming that fear is already a profound act of awareness. Not to expose yourself recklessly, but to stop hiding from yourself. Contemporary spirituality also benefits from this perspective. Instead of seeking transcendence as an escape from pain, we begin to see it as full presence with what is. Vulnerability, in this sense, doesn't distance us from the sacred. It brings us closer. Because whatever name you give to the divine, it doesn't demand perfection. It asks for truth, wholeness, presence. As we accept vulnerability as part of a meaningful life, our relationship with failure begins to change. Mistakes stop being proof of inadequacy and become part of learning. The pain doesn't disappear, but it becomes fertile. Human imperfection stops being a problem and becomes the ground where authenticity grows. And maybe the most important question of this chapter isn't, how can I be less vulnerable? But something far more honest. With whom can I be vulnerable? Because as we accept this condition, a deeper need emerges. The need to belong not through adaptation but through truth. And that's where the journey takes another step toward the heart of the book. Belonging is not fitting in, it's being seen without masks. For a long time, I confused belonging with acceptance. I thought belonging meant being well-liked, approved of, praised. Only later did I realize how much that cost me. Because in order to be accepted, I had to adapt. Soften my opinions. Dilute my truths. Hide parts of myself that weren't convenient. Brené Brown is direct. When we give up who we are in order to belong, we end up not truly belonging at all. There's a subtle but profound difference between fitting in and belonging. Fitting in means shaping yourself to the environment. Belonging means being recognized without having to distort yourself. The first requires constant performance. The second requires presence. And this distinction completely changes how we experience relationships, work, and even spirituality. True belonging grows out of authenticity, not conformity. In existential philosophy, the desire to belong is ontological. It's part of the human condition. We don't just want to survive, we want to be seen. Not just coexist, we want to be recognized in our uniqueness. When that doesn't happen, a diffuse sense of loneliness emerges, even when we're surrounded by people. It's the loneliness of not being able to be whole. I've been in environments where everything seemed fine, people, conversations, routines. Yet something in me stayed silent. It wasn't shyness. It was self-protection. On some level, I knew there was no space there for my most honest questions, my less organized emotions. And when we can't be vulnerable, belonging turns into mere coexistence. Brené Brown shows that belonging begins on the inside. When we don't accept ourselves, we look outside for validation that never fully satisfies. Self-acceptance isn't complacency, it's recognition. It's looking at yourself and saying, this too is me. Without emotional makeup. Without a performance contract. This inner gesture is the first step toward conscious relationships. A simple but transformative practice is to notice where you feel you have to perform. Where do you over-edit your words? Where do you avoid certain topics to prevent discomfort? Where do you feel loved only in parts? These clues reveal where you adapt and where you truly belong. Awareness here isn't judgment, it's liberation. At work, this shows up when we silence our values to keep our position. In relationships, when we avoid hard conversations to preserve affection. In spirituality, when we perform faith while carrying deep doubts. Brené Brown reminds us that the cost of not belonging is always paid internally, in the form of disconnection and emptiness. True belonging requires emotional courage. It requires the risk of being seen as you are, without guarantees of acceptance. That's frightening. But it's also the only path to deep relationships and a meaningful life. The empathy we seek from others begins when we grant ourselves permission to exist without masks. When I started being more honest about who I was, my limits, my questions, my imperfections, some people drifted away. And that hurt. But others moved closer in ways I had never experienced before. Less quantity, more truth, less noise, more presence. And that's when I understood, belonging isn't about the crowd, it's about real connection. And once we realize this, a new question arises with quiet force. What does it take to sustain this truth in everyday life, even when we're afraid? Because being seen is only the beginning. The next step is showing up, day after day, with courage despite the fear. And that's exactly where the meaning of courage itself begins to change. Everyday courage, showing up even when you're afraid. For a long time, I waited to feel ready before acting. Ready to speak, ready to change, ready to try something new. I believed courage came before action, like emotional fuel. Brené Brown helped me reverse that logic. Courage doesn't eliminate fear, it walks alongside it. And more often than not, it only appears after we take the first step. The courage to be imperfect redefines courage in a deeply human way. Not as grand heroic acts, but as small daily exposures. Saying how you feel, setting boundaries, asking for help, admitting you can't do everything. These acts don't earn applause, but they build a meaningful life. They're quiet choices that strengthen inner growth. I started noticing this in the simplest decisions. A respectful but firm no. Asking for help without over-explaining. Starting a hard conversation even with a trembling voice. Every time I showed up, something in me grew stronger, not because it worked out but because I was true. Authenticity, when practiced, becomes emotional muscle. In existential philosophy, courage isn't the absence of anxiety, but the willingness to act despite it. Kierkegaard said that to dare is to lose your balance for a moment. Not to dare is to lose yourself. Brené Brown brings this into everyday life. Not showing up out of fear of making mistakes is a slow form of self-abandonment, and it carries a high long-term cost. In personal development, many people get stuck consuming knowledge. They read, watch, learn, but don't apply. Everyday courage is the bridge between knowing and living. For example, if you know you need to express yourself more, try writing one unedited page a day. If you know you need to take a stand, start with a safe conversation. Practice comes before confidence. At work, emotional courage shows up when we give honest feedback, when we own mistakes without self-erasure, when we lead with humanity. Vulnerable leadership isn't weakness, it's clarity. People follow what's real. Brené Brown shows that emotionally safe environments foster more creativity, more engagement, and more conscious relationships. In personal life, showing up with fear means stopping the wait for an ideal version of yourself. It means loving without guarantees, creating without certainty of recognition, choosing without clear maps. It requires presence. It requires accepting human imperfection as part of the process. There's no authenticity without risk, and no full life without authenticity. A simple practice to strengthen this courage is to ask yourself, when facing a decision, what would the most honest version of me do right now? Not the most perfect, not the safest, the most honest. Asked with awareness, this question usually points toward the path that avoids emotional shortcuts but builds integrity. Over time, I realized that fear doesn't disappear, it changes function. Instead of paralyzing me, it informs me. Instead of saying stop, it says, this matters. And when something matters, it's worth showing up for. Even with a racing heart. Even without guarantees. But showing up all the time is exhausting. And that's where a new challenge emerges. The strategies we create to protect ourselves from pain slowly turn into emotional armor. They defend us, but they also keep us from life. And looking at that requires an even deeper level of inner honesty. Emotional armor, how we protect ourselves from pain and lose our lives. At some point in life, all of us learn how to protect ourselves. Not out of weakness, but out of survival. After a disappointment, a harsh criticism, or an experience of abandonment, we create strategies to make sure we never feel that pain again. Brené Brown calls these strategies emotional armor. They work, up to a point. The problem is that when we wear them for too long, they don't just protect us from pain, they also protect us from joy. I began to recognize my own armor when I started paying attention to my automatic reactions. Perfectionism disguised as excellence. Control presented as responsibility. Cynicism that looked like emotional intelligence. Emotional numbness that came in the form of constant distraction. All of it had a noble intention, to avoid suffering. But the side effect was a life that felt less and less alive. Perfectionism may be the most socially accepted form of armor. It promises approval, recognition, belonging. But in exchange, it demands the impossibility of rest. Brené Brown is clear. Perfectionism is not the pursuit of excellence, it's the fear of shame. It's the attempt to be flawless so we won't be rejected. And that keeps the soul in a permanent state of alert. Control is another powerful form of armor. When we try to control everything, we believe we're reducing risk. But life is not a closed system. Relationships, emotions, creative processes, all of these require space for the unpredictable. Existential philosophy reminds us that trying to control what cannot be controlled is a sophisticated form of denying reality. Excessive control creates rigidity, not safety. Cynicism emerges after repeated disappointment. It's a way of saying, I don't expect anything anymore. It can look like maturity, but often it's sadness that has given up on feeling. And emotional numbness, whether through overwork, consumption, constant entertainment, or even superficial spirituality, is the final layer of armor. When we don't feel pain, we also don't feel joy, gratitude, or presence. A transformative practice is to notice when you react automatically, when you defend yourself before listening, when you use irony to distance yourself from what touches you deeply, when you stay constantly busy to avoid feeling. Instead of judging yourself, simply notice. Ask, what is this armor trying to protect me from? That question creates space for awareness without inner violence. In-depth psychology, integrating armor doesn't mean destroying it, but acknowledging its purpose and choosing when to use it. In some contexts, it's necessary. The problem is living armored all the time. Conscious vulnerability is the ability to lower your guard when the context is safe. And that's something we learn through practice and gentleness. Brené Brown invites us to replace armor with boundaries. Armor isolates. Boundaries connect. When I say, this is not acceptable to me, I'm protecting myself without shutting down. When I say, this hurt me, I'm exposing myself without erasing who I am. This is a key principle for conscious relationships and emotionally healthy leadership. I noticed that as I let go of certain armor, my relationships became more real, less perfect, more alive. There were conflicts, but there was also truth. There was discomfort, but there was also inner growth. Emotional healing rarely happens in comfort. It happens in sustained honesty. And as we begin to lower these defenses, an inevitable practical question arises. How do we live relationships, work, and spirituality without this armor? How do we apply all of this in the real world where there are people, demands, and expectations? That's exactly what we begin to explore in the next step of the journey. Relationships, work, and spirituality through the lens of vulnerability. Everything we've talked about so far either gains meaning or loses it in everyday practice. Emotional courage isn't tested in isolation, but in relationships. It's in work, family, intimate connections, and spirituality that vulnerability stops being a concept and becomes lived experience. Brené Brown reminds us, there is no inner growth disconnected from real life. In intimate relationships, vulnerability is the ground of trust. When we hide our feelings to avoid conflict, we create distance. When we pretend everything is fine to keep the peace, we sacrifice truth. Conscious relationships aren't those without friction, but those where there is a safe space to say, this affected me, this hurt me, this matters to me. Empathy is born in that space. I've seen long-term relationships become shallow due to a lack of emotional exposure. And I've seen new relationships become deep because someone dared to be honest early on. It's not time that creates intimacy, it's the courage to show up without masks. This applies to friendships, romantic partnerships, and even long-standing family relationships, where we often repeat roles without questioning them. At work, vulnerability is still viewed with suspicion. But vulnerable leadership doesn't mean fragility, it means emotional clarity. Leaders who admit mistakes create safer environments. Teams that can speak without fear innovate more. Brené Brown shows, through both data and experience, that psychologically safe environments are more productive, more creative, and more human. A simple practice at work is to replace automatic defensiveness with curiosity. Instead of reacting, ask questions. Instead of justifying, listen. Instead of controlling, align expectations. These gestures may seem small, but they transform professional relationships into conscious ones. Personal development also means learning how to work with people, not against them. In spirituality, vulnerability invites us to let go of the performance of being enlightened. We don't need to be calm, grateful, or confident all the time. The deepest contemporary spirituality doesn't run from pain, it welcomes it. Doubts, crises, and questions don't distance us from the sacred. Often they are the path. I had to dismantle the idea that spirituality meant the absence of inner conflict. When I accepted my contradictions, my practice became more honest, less technical, more present. Awareness doesn't come from denying the shadow, but from integrating it. And this applies to meditation, prayer, silence, or study alike. A practical exercise for integrating vulnerability across these three areas is to notice where you stay silent to preserve external comfort. Then choose a safe space to express something true. Not everything. Not all at once, but something real. Vulnerability isn't indiscriminate exposure. It's presence with discernment. Gradually, something interesting happens. Relationships become simpler. Fewer games. Less reading between the lines. More clarity. This doesn't eliminate conflict, but it makes it more honest. And honesty is one of the pillars of a meaningful life. But there is still a powerful obstacle on this path. One that, when faced, produces a true emotional catharsis. An obstacle that cannot survive the light of human connection. Shame, however quiet it may be, does not survive empathy. And this is where something truly begins to dissolve. Shame does not survive empathy. There is something deeply liberating about being understood without having to over-explain yourself. A look that welcomes. A silence that doesn't judge. A presence that says without words, you're not alone. Brené Brown states something both simple and radical. Shame does not survive empathy. It dissolves when it meets genuine human connection. Shame feeds on isolation. It grows when we believe we're the only ones like this, that no one would understand, that being seen would lead to rejection. But one empathic encounter is enough to break the spell. When someone listens to our story with openness, something inside reorganizes. A wounded identity begins to heal. I experienced this very concretely when I shared a vulnerability I had kept hidden for years. I didn't receive brilliant advice. I didn't hear magical solutions. What I received was presence. And that changed everything. Emotional healing often doesn't come from answers. It comes from recognition. From being seen as human, not as a problem. Empathy is not agreement. It's not minimizing pain. It's not fixing the other person. Empathy is holding space for someone to be who they are in that moment. In depth psychology, this kind of attuned listening creates emotional safety. And safety is the environment where shame cannot breathe. A powerful practice is learning to offer empathy without rushing. When someone shares something difficult, resist the urge to solve it. Instead, say things like, "I can see how heavy that was," or, "It makes sense that you'd feel this way." These simple phrases build conscious, deep relationships. They communicate belonging without demanding performance. But the most challenging empathy is the one we offer ourselves. Many people are compassionate with others but brutally harsh with themselves. Self-acceptance isn't indulgence. It's honesty without cruelty. It's recognizing limits without turning them into a fixed identity. Brené Brown insists, speaking to yourself with kindness is an act of emotional courage. A practical exercise is to observe your inner language when you make a mistake. Do you call yourself incompetent or a learner? Do you punish yourself or guide yourself? Replacing judgment with curiosity transforms the inner dialogue. And that dialogue defines how you show up in the world. Awareness begins with how we talk to ourselves. In spirituality, empathy takes the form of compassion. Not an idealized, distant compassion, but one that recognizes pain as part of the human experience. When we stop fighting our human imperfection, something settles. Life stops feeling like a test and starts feeling like a process. Empathy also creates safe spaces in relationships. When we know we can make mistakes without being discarded, we dare more. We love more. We create more. Shame loses its power because it no longer finds the silence it needs to survive. And as shame begins to dissolve, something essential emerges. The possibility of living whole. Not flawless, whole. With imperfections, emotions, limits, and truth. At this point, The courage to be imperfect stops being an idea and becomes a way of living. The courage to be imperfect, living whole, not flawless. At some point in the journey, it becomes clear that the problem was never making mistakes. The problem was believing we had to be flawless to deserve love, respect, or belonging. The Courage to Be Imperfect by Brené Brown leads us precisely to this place of integration. It's not about fixing human imperfection but about stopping the fight against it. Living whole means accepting that we are made of contrast, strength and fear, clarity and doubt, courage and vulnerability coexist. Existential philosophy has always affirmed this. Life is not a project of perfection but of presence. When we try to be flawless, we fragment ourselves. When we accept being whole, we become integrated. I realized this when I stopped demanding absolute consistency from myself. When I accepted that some days would be confusing, others quiet, others fertile. This acceptance didn't make me complacent, it made me more honest. Self-acceptance doesn't reduce inner growth, it sustains it. We grow better when we don't hate ourselves for what we're still learning. Brené Brown proposes a radical shift in metrics, moving from the question, "Was I good enough?" to the question, "Was I true?" This simple change reorganizes life entirely. Relationships become more authentic. Work gains deeper meaning. Spirituality stops being a distant ideal and becomes a daily practice of presence and awareness. In depth psychology, integrating imperfection means integrating the shadow. Not denying flaws but dialoguing with them. Not justifying mistakes but learning from them. This creates emotional maturity. Whole people aren't those who never fall, they're the ones who know how to get back up without abandoning themselves. A concrete practice is to review your day with gentleness. Instead of listing only what was missing, notice where you were honest, where you set boundaries, where you showed up despite fear. These small inner victories are rarely celebrated, but they are what build a meaningful life. True personal development happens in these details. In the realm of conscious relationships, living whole means allowing yourself to be seen in process. Not as someone finished, but as someone committed to truth. This deepens bonds and filters out connections based on unrealistic expectations. Real belonging emerges when we no longer have to edit our humanity. Spiritually, the courage to be imperfect brings us back to the ground. Less idealization, more embodiment, less chasing elevated states, more presence in the now. The most mature form of contemporary spirituality doesn't promise escape from suffering, but integration of it into awareness. When we look back, we realize that pain didn't destroy us, it taught us. Vulnerability didn't weaken us, it humanized us. Shame lost its power when it was met with empathy. And in the end, living whole is an ongoing act of emotional courage. And perhaps at this point, a quiet question arises within you. How does all of this show up in real life on an ordinary day with bills, relationships, and decisions? This is where the journey meets the ground of experience. Because now it's no longer about understanding, it's about living. When courage meets everyday life, a story about living whole. I want to end this journey by telling you a simple story. Not epic, not extraordinary. Precisely for that reason, true. It's the story of an ordinary person, like me, like you, who had to apply the courage to be imperfect on a completely normal day. He woke up that morning already tired. Not physically but emotionally. He had a difficult conversation to have at work, something he had been postponing for weeks. He knew how he felt. He knew what he needed to say. But shame whispered, "This will cause problems, you'll disappoint people, better stay quiet." The old armor of silence felt safer. On the way, he noticed something different. Instead of pushing the fear away, he acknowledged it. "I'm afraid because this matters." He didn't try to look strong. He didn't rehearse perfect lines. He simply decided to show up as he was. Vulnerable, human, present. For the first time, he wasn't seeking control, he was seeking truth. The conversation wasn't flawless. His voice shook at times. There were pauses. There was discomfort. But there was something new, honesty. He spoke about limits, exhaustion, unrealistic expectations. He didn't accuse. He didn't over-justify. He was simply authentic. And something curious happened. The world didn't end. On the contrary, a space of respect began to form. Later, at home, he realized that this everyday courage had an effect. It didn't immediately change the external world, but it changed something internal. A quiet relief, a sense of alignment. He hadn't been perfect, he had been whole. And that brought peace. A subtle peace, but a deep one. This is the real-life application of the Courage to Be Imperfect by Brené Brown. It's not about grand speeches, but about small inner decisions. Choosing empathy over isolation. Awareness over automatism. Presence over performance. This is how inner growth happens, step by step, choice by choice. Maybe you're postponing a conversation. Maybe you're hiding behind perfectionism. Maybe you're trying to belong by over-adapting. The question isn't whether you're afraid. We all are. The question is, what would you do if you didn't need to be flawless to deserve love, respect, and belonging? And more than that, where in your life can you lower an armor today? Where can you practice self-acceptance instead of self-criticism? Where can you offer empathy, to yourself or to someone close to you? These questions don't demand quick answers. They ask for presence. They ask for truth. They ask for emotional courage. Living a meaningful life isn't about eliminating human imperfection. It's about making peace with it. It's about allowing yourself to be seen. It's about choosing conscious relationships. It's about understanding that vulnerability isn't the price of life. It's the path to living it fully. If this content touched something inside you, don't let it fade into silence. Bring it into everyday life. Observe your choices. Practice slowly. And if you'd like to continue exploring existential philosophy, depth psychology, and contemporary spirituality in a grounded, human way, subscribe to the channel The Philosophy of Awareness and the Soul. Turn on notifications and keep walking this journey of awareness, courage, and a life with meaning.